Hello for yet another week, allied health students. We're back again for the online lectures. Hope everybody, is getting into the routine now. We're hitting our stride as we go along here. This is week 5. We're going to be talking about emotion. So, as I was sort of foreshadowing when we were talking about this last week, emotion ties in closely to some of the motivation stuff we were talking about before. So, if we look at the guide just quickly here, these first 4 sections here, what are emotions, the physiological display and cognitive components, that's just all about what emotions are in and of themselves. And those last 2 elements, these are the more complicated facets of emotional experience, or what emotions are like for us, the stuff that we need to know for this topic. They are specific to the interaction between emotions and motivation. You have to sort of know both of them to make sense of those last 2 topics, which is why we kind of do this in the order that we do. I also apologize if the lighting is a bit darker right now than it usually is. It's just storming non-stop. As anyone who's also in Sydney would know, it's been the case lately. Constant rain. But let's go into this. What are emotions? Now, that seems like a bit of a silly thing to say. I feel silly saying it, as if I'm a robot saying, tell me about your human emotions, etc. We all know what emotions are in the folk psychological sense because we feel them, we experience them in real time, and I'll make some reference to that as we go along here. But the mechanistic value of what emotions are, what they are in a more complicated psychological science sense, that's the level of understanding we're going to need to have to continue on here, because that has some important cash-out value for us in terms of how you interact with people, especially when they're under particular kinds of emotional duress. So, the general way we describe emotions in a folk psychological sense, especially in English, although this is cross-cultural to a certain degree, you get variants of it in other cultures, is with a tactile metaphor. We use a reference to our somatosense, our sense of touch, in order to talk about our emotions, because we call them things like feelings or what something feels like. And it's no accident why we do that. It's no accident why it's a cross-cultural metaphor that a lot of people use, because our emotions, compared to all of the other forms of cognitive processing that we're going to touch on in this little course here, more than any of the others, our emotions are a radically embodied sensation. We don't just esoterically think of our emotions, we're not just aware of them in some aloof judgment sort of sense. Our emotions feel like they are in our bodies. In fact, under some circumstances, it feels like our emotions emerge from our bodies. So that's part of why, especially in the West, we have a kind of a historical legacy of thinking about our emotions as being more a property of our bodies than of our minds. That, and the same way we have conflict under some circumstances between the desires of the mind and the inclinations of the body, you'll often hear about emotions being discussed in the context of logic, and that emotions are in some sense in opposition to logic. Now that sense, especially in the Western world, is very closely tied to certain big icons of popular culture and our intellectual inheritance in general. A lot of it starts with classical dualists like René Descartes and other people in the subsequent Enlightenment era. But, a lot of you will be familiar with prototypical characters like Dr. Spock, and how he will describe emotion as being the opposite of logic. So to be a logical being, he has to be, recused of emotions, etc., etc. Now, while that does ring intuitively true to some sense, because a lot of us can think of anecdotal instances in our lives when our emotions have just gotten us into terrible trouble or given us an inclination that just didn't make sense, things like this, I want to just start out by saying, and none of the rest of what I talk about will make sense unless you know this from the get-go, the idea that emotions are irrational, the idea that emotions are immune to logic, etc., is deeply mistaken. It is very, very wrong. And unless we understand that, we can't really go forward with this. Part of, especially the cognitive component of emotions that we're going to talk about a little bit later, is about understanding the inherent heuristic logic of emotions, why they are the way they are, and what they do for us, in that context. Our emotions may not always be what we want to be experiencing in any given moment, but they have a kind of deep biological and evolutionary logic to them that I'll explain as we go along the way here. So, if we want to get technical about this, we want to step away from folk psychology and talk mechanism for a moment. Our emotions are what we would describe as spontaneous, evaluative responses that we experience involuntarily. So, they're a reaction to something in the environment, almost reflex-like in that sense. When we make a certain judgment about the environment, we have a response emotion, and they are not just neutral responses, they're evaluative responses. They have a positive or negative valence to them. That's why we have good emotions and bad emotions, but that value judgment is built into the reaction itself, and we have them whether we want to or not. Although we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to emotion regulation later on. An individual emotion by itself doesn't make a lot of sense. It's part of why emotions can seem illogical if you talk about just things like anger and sadness and things like this out of context. But when you take a creature's emotions all together as a suite, as a kind of functioning system, the best way to think of emotions in that sense, and this is more obvious when we talk about animals than humans, so that's the direction I'll go in for a moment here, but our emotions are a basic control system for a social organism. If you are a social organism, your emotions and the kind of things that they respond to and the kind of things they prime you to do are a really simple and straightforward way to engage with your environment and make adaptive decisions. So what does all of that mean? I'm sure I've lost a couple of you. Let me ground it in an example here. So there's a little bit of disagreement still in some corners. It seems very outmoded to me. But what we're going to be talking about is emotions in animals for a moment. So in case any of you are questioning this, yes, animals experience emotions. Especially social animals have very similar repertoires of emotions to what we do. So we're not going to be overly anthropomorphizing animals here. We're not going to be reading too much into them. The parallels that we see here are exactly the empirical basis that I'm relying on in these examples. So let's look at some animals. Now, imagine this was a lineup of animals that was really in front of you in real time, and you had to make the judgment which of these animals means you harm. If you were to take a guess, you'd probably say the tiger. And again, that's not because you necessarily know anything about tiger behavior. Probably anyone watching this knows nothing about tiger behavior, but you see yourself in this tiger to a certain extent. It has the snarling up muscles around its lips, the frowning eyebrows. I mean, to a certain extent, we think to ourselves, if I make that expression, what am I feeling? I'm feeling aggression, I'm feeling anger, I have a lowered inhibition towards doing harm to somebody. Which of these animals, if they were real and in front of you, would be glad to see you? Almost everybody who is watching this will either go with the chimpanzee because it's like, it looks like it's having a good time, smiling, happy, we can relate to that, the pulling up of the corners of the mouth, the bunching up of the eyes. Or maybe some of you will go with the raccoon because what the raccoon is showing is surprise, and surprise often leads into other emotions like happiness and things like this. If this were a birthday party and the raccoon were going, then, it's probably a precursor to happiness in that sense. Which of these animals doesn't care at all what's going on here? Almost everybody will say it's the orangutan, that kind of contemptuous, low-energy expression. Even though these creatures are quite removed from us, a lot of them, we can see the same traces of emotions in them, and they have that same underlying behavioral component to them. But more often than not, it's a fairly reliable heuristic to rely on, that if you look at a creature, if you look at a non-human animal, especially a social mammal or something like this, they're the closest ones to us, you can read their emotions in a similar way to how you can read emotions on human beings. That's because of the deep legacy of where they come from, where emotions come from on an evolutionary level. Now, just touching on this quickly, because this is a little bit more technical than you'll need to know, but it'll be important when we cross-pollinate this with other parts of the brain later on. When we think of emotions as a control system, you have to remember that emotions are processed in the middle part of the brain that we refer to as the limbic system. For anyone who can't visualize that, on this kind of triune model of the brain, we have our big, wrinkly neocortex around the outside. That green part in the middle there, that is the limbic system, or the mammalian complex, as it's sometimes called. It sits on top of the R complex, or the hindbrain, as it is often known. And you can tell a lot about a creature and the depth of emotional experience that it is capable of by how big its limbic system is relative to the other proportions of its brain. Very, very tiny in reptiles, pretty big in birds and mammals, super big in social birds and mammals, enormous in creatures like us, although it is quite dwarfed by our enormous neocortex because we have very complicated logical and perceptual abilities. So, this is just a side view of what that limbic system looks like. Just, again, we'll touch on bits and pieces of this later on, the fornix, the hippocampus, the amygdala, etc. But this is the region of the brain we're concerned with. The idea being that the most basic control system for any animal, and indeed especially any social animal, is this limbic brain, is the repertoire of reactions and evaluative responses that their whole suite of emotions gives them in a social context. And what I'm emphasizing on this sort of slide here, I'm getting towards the end of my time, is that all of our reasoning abilities and our planning abilities, like we talked about with cognition last week, these build upon but do not replace this basic control system of having just knee-jerk, immediate reactions to our external environment. So, how many emotions are there? I'll just give some quick guides along the way here, because some emotions are kind of combinatorial of other sensations. This is Plutchik's wheel of emotions. It's a good way of plotting out the most common emotions that we tend to talk about in English, at the very least, and how several of them are different intensity versions of other ones. So there's joy, serenity, and ecstasy. These are similar emotions to each other, but ecstasy is more intense or viscerally vivid than serenity is a low energy form of it. This is a version of it with faces, in case you can't picture it super well. But last thing I want to talk about here, that's why this video is going to run slightly long, I'm pushing two things together here, is I talk about feelings here. Emotions we talk about them with a tactile metaphor, we talk about them as feelings, but the other thing we usually use to describe feelings is mood. And emotions and mood are closely related to each other, but they're not exactly the same thing. So I'll take an extra minute or so here just to quickly disambiguate that. Emotions are immediate sensations. They just hit you like a truck, like in real time, that are intense, short-lived. They have profound influences on your behavior and your immediate thoughts in real time. That's what emotions are for. They're for controlling your behavior in real time. Moods are a parallel version of this, but they're more associated with planning and putting together your long-term cognition. A mood is a longer duration, lower intensity version of an emotion. In fact, it doesn't have some of the components of emotions. It's mostly just that positive or negative feeling. It's a diffuse feeling of positivity or negativity, but you get those from positive or negative emotions, and it's a running evaluation that corresponds to our general state. In that sense, the better we're doing, the better a mood we tend to be in. If things are going poorly for us, we tend to be in a low or a negative mood. So the important thing between these to keep in mind is that they serve two different functions, and the mood function is kind of secondary to the emotional function. The emotional function works in real time, has an immediate effect on behavior, whereas mood is more about your thinking patterns, your planning. In essence, positive mood makes you more optimistic when you're making plans, negative mood makes you more pessimistic. So I can summarize that with just this little table here. The duration, emotions are immediate. They go for seconds or minutes, tops. Moods, they go for hours or days, or if you have a mood disorder, sometimes protracted for weeks or months. Emotions their function is biasing our actions in real time, whereas mood is about biasing our cognition and our planning. The antecedent event, the thing that triggers an emotion, is some object-focused thing in real time. You're reacting to some judgment about the world in real time when an emotion starts up, whereas moods are kind of general, non-specific events. They accumulate over time. In fact, usually it's just the previous emotions that you've had, and whether they were positive or negative, that changes your mood, puts it up or down over time. And as I said, emotions are high intensity, and even though mood can be very debilitating when it's quite intense, relative to an emotion, mood is very low intensity. So all of this that we're talking about here, I know some of you will be thinking about the perspectives that we had before. For the most part, the perspectives in psychology that are most relevant here are the psychodynamic and the cognitive. In essence, we'll jump between them as we go along here. The psychodynamic perspective was that emotions emerge from unconsciousness and have some interpretable characteristic to them. We'll talk about that. And the cognitive approach is about how emotions depend on and bias us in particular directions for different kinds of actions and judgments. We'll talk about that in the fourth component of this. But next up is the physiological reactions. I will see you all there. Keeping in mind that that is the structure we're dealing with here. All emotions, just by their very nature, have physiological, behavioral, and cognitive components. So we're going to go through them one at a time. See you in the next video.